Hey yo, what's good? It's your boy Mixtape Moth, and today I'm gonna hit y'all with a little DITC appreciation by giving y'all my top 5 DITC solo releases. Let's get to it. Alright, so DITC, which stands for Diggin in the Crates Crew, is a very slept on and underappreciated collective of 8 MCs and producers, primarily from the Bronx, who helped shape much of the golden era New York hip hop sound in the 90s. So DITC consists of the following 8 members: Lord Finesse, Diamond D, Fat Joe, Big L, Buck Wild, Showbiz, and AG, and OC. Now, all of the members hailed from the Bronx, with the exception of the late great Big L, who came from Harlem, and OC, who represented Brooklyn. Yes, there were additional members of the collective, like the late Party Artie and DJ OG, but when people talk about DITC, they mainly think of the main 8 members. All of the individuals within this collective have achieved some level of solo success over the years, whether commercially or in the upper levels of the underground. Fat Joe obviously became the most well-known in terms of sales and popularity, and we don't know the heights that Big L might have reached in the industry since he was tragically taken from us in the late 90s. Now, in the 90s, there were other stellar New York rap collectives, Wu-Tang being the most notable. You also had important crews like the Native Tongues and the supremely slept on Boot Camp Clique. But today I wanted to highlight DITC because I feel they were a really distinct crew that represented the essence of the 90s New York boom bap sound. Not only was this crew made up of distinguished MCs who each had their own very unique voices and lyrical styles, but the producers from the clique were just as significant. Basically, half the crew consisted of producers, some of whom also rap, like Lord Finesse and Diamond D. So DITC could be looked at as a double threat because they could do it all, whether it was providing dope production or giving you fly rhymes. Now, today I wanted to touch upon 5 of my favorite DITC solo releases. These are the ones that I tend to replay the most to this day, and they are in no particular order. Starting with number 6. Yeah, I'm actually going to throw in a bonus round. Now, this is actually not a solo album, but it's the DITC group album that came out in the year 2000. So this album had been highly anticipated for some time in the late 90s, but it just never came out until the year 2000. And by this time, most hardcore DITC fans had already heard a bulk of the songs. However, this is still a very solid album, especially if you want a collection of some harder to find DITC songs that are all available on one album. I'm talking about classic 90s records like Day One, The Enemy, and Drop It Heavy. Also, this album had 2 DJ Premier produced bangers, Thick and the Ebonics remix. As a whole, this album wasn't perfect, but I feel it's an important release that all DITC fans should own or at least check out. Now, getting into this actual list, at number 5, I have Big L's Lifestylez of the Poor and Dangerous. This was his 1995 debut album and his only official album that he made while alive, as the Big Picture was actually assembled after his death. While I feel the Big Picture is probably more cohesive sonically, I still view it as a posthumous album. Sure, Lifestylez of the Poor and Dangerous isn't deemed as a flawless body of work. Maybe to really hardcore Big L fans it is, but it does feature some really raw and uncut mid-90s production from Lord Finesse, Buck Wild, and Showbiz. Some highlights include the Buck Wild produced anthem, Put It On, which had the signature DITC bells and the energetic hook from Kid Capri. Also, there was the hit single MVP, which had a slick DeBarge sample. Then there was the grimy posse cut 8 Is Enough, which had Children of the Corn members Herb McGruff and Cameron, and I believe this was the first time that we heard Cameron on wax. Another strong posse cut was The Graveyard. This featured an early Jay-Z verse Before the fame, there was also the horrorcore themed Danger Zone, produced by Buck Wild, which featured Herb McGruff, because 139 in Lennox is the danger zone where no man could withstand or hold his own. And my favorite would have to be Street Struck, which was a compelling cautionary tale about the pitfalls of living the street life. It had a really nice jazzy and melancholy beat from Buck Wild. Coming in at number 4 is Lord Finesse's The Awakening from 1996. Interestingly enough, this was regarded as an EP, even though it was close to an hour in length. I remember this project was supposed to come out in 1995, but it was heavily delayed. Now, obviously, it wasn't as critically acclaimed as his debut album, The Funky Technician from 1990, or his sophomore effort, Return of the Funky Man, but personally for me, I enjoyed it a little more. Although the reality was, Lord Finesse's rapping performance wasn't as strong on The Awakening as it was on his first 2 albums, but I view the production as far superior. At this time in 1996, I feel Lord Finesse started to really come into his own as a producer. The instrumentals on this project still had a jazzy undercurrent, but they were a little bit darker and more refined. The only drawback to this project, in my opinion, was the plethora of skits. But at least the beats for those were pretty eclectic and flavorful. Some standout tracks were No Gimmicks featuring the Blast Master KRS-One. Here the two called out the fake and fraudulent MCs over a crunchy boom bap instrumental with these aggressive horns. KRS-One was actually featured again on what is probably my favorite song, Brainstorm / PSK. This had a Biggie sample and it featured incredible verses from OC and KRS-One. Now, the beat was a little spookier than normal Lord Finesse production, almost as if he had channeled DJ Muggs. It was just a deafening and hard as nails posse cut. There was also the super eerie Actual Facts, which featured Brand Nubian and Large Professor. And of course, there was his light-hearted and groovy Hip to the Game single, a track that would later be resurrected by the late great Mac Miller for his 2010 single Kool-Aid and Frozen Pizza. I know this Lord Finesse project was very slept on and not talked about very often, but I feel it had some of the best DITC production in 1996. At number 3, I have OC's Jewelz. This was his sophomore album that dropped in 1997. So with all of the strong commercial releases that came out that year, and trust me, there are a lot, this project, OC Jewelz, still ended up ranking very high on my annual list. To me, OC is the definition of an unsung MC. He's probably the best all-around versatile lyricist from the crew. Many have even labeled him the Nas of D.I.T.C. In fact, there are even some parallels as to how both Nas and OC shook up the New York rap world with their debut albums in 1994. Now, when making this list, I found it a little challenging to determine which one to include. Would it be Word Life or Jewelz? But at the end of the day, I ended up going with Jewelz because I feel the production had aged a little better. Now, don't get it twisted. Word Life is a certified classic, in my opinion, but I just tend to play Jewelz a little more. Also, this album had 4 dope beats from DJ Premier, 2 of which I consider spectacular. One of those being My World, which flipped a smooth Barry White sample and had what sounded like this Wild West whistle. In my opinion, My World was the perfect blend of introspective and boastful lyricism. The other being Mug, which had an exhilarating beat from Primo and a scorching verse from Freddie Fox. The remaining production came from Buck Wild, Lord Finesse, DJ OG, Showbiz, and The Beatminers. Other highlights included the silky smooth and melodic The Chosen One, produced by Buck Wild, and the album's R&B layered single, Far From Yours. Far From Yours was a song that received some criticism from purists, and I never could really understand why. Perhaps those folks considered the production to be a little too glossy and shining for D.I.T.C. Sanders. I don't know. I personally dug it a lot. There were also some great storytelling moments on tracks like Strong J and The Crow. Also, the somber and self-reflective title track produced by Lord Finesse, which showcased OC's knack for deep introspection. For the number 2 spot, I have Show and AG's Goodfellas. This was their sophomore album that came out in the spring of '95. It's not as praised as their 1992 debut, Runaway Slave, which was fantastic, but personally for me, I find myself enjoying Goodfellas just a bit more. I think the main reason being was the slight variation in production from the upbeat, jazzier sounds found on Runaway Slave to a version of slightly darker boom bap on Goodfellas. Don't get it twisted, there were still playful and quirkier jazz moments to be found, but this album experimented with some of the more serious and grimier sonics that became popular in 1995. Also, Showbiz wasn't rapping on this album, unlike their debut, so you had much more AG rapping throughout. And let's face it, AG's rhyming ability is clearly superior to Showbiz's, whose strength lied in the production. Now, as far as the tracks that really stood out, of course, there was the hard-hitting opener, Never Less Than Ill. The bells and the brutal drums on Check It Out definitely had that definitive DITC flavor. The tambourines and funky horns on the Lord Finesse produced Add On gave it a classic 1995 feel. There was also the smooth and head-bobbing DJ Premier produced Next Level remix. Another high point was the rugged and dark posse cut Got the Flavor featuring Method Man, D-Flow, Party Artie, and Wally World. And there was also the jazzy and feel-good Got Your Back, which had a dope back and forth between AG and Wally World. I think what I like most about this album was not just AG's boastful bars and his raw and urgent delivery, but it was also the mixture of raw, playful, and eerie production that made it stick out as a memorable DITC release for the time. And coming in at number 1 is Diamond D and the Psychotic Neurotic Stunts, Blunts, and Hip Hop. This was Diamond D's solo debut that had dropped in 1992. Some have even labeled this debut album as the East Coast equivalent to Dr. Dre's The Chronic, as they were both created in the same year by producers who also rapped and who wanted to introduce new talented artists within their respective crews. As a result, this album ended up being the best representation of the DITC sound in the early 90s. It was a more improved sonic version of Lord Finesse's first 2 albums. The thing about Diamond D's production, especially at this time, but really throughout the whole 90s, was that it was heavily sample-based, ultra funky, carefree, and filled with that crate digging appeal. Some might even argue that the production on Stunts, Blunts, and Hip Hop was slightly ahead of its time for 1992 and even a little experimental. Some highlights include the xylophone-backed Red Light, Green Light, also the smooth I Went For Mine. Now, the infectious loop on this track would later be sampled by Busta Rhymes for his single New York Shit. Check 1 2 was a raw, braggadocio record with scratching and this psychedelic guitar loop. There was also the R&B friendly single Confused, which had great storytelling. In my opinion, it was the perfect example of how an artist should make an R&B slash radio friendly track without selling out. Then there was the classic and mid-tempo storytelling track Sally Got a One Track Mind. Other standouts included A Day in the Life with Brand Nubian and the upbeat and funky Fuck What You Heard that had the prominent Sadat X vocals scratched on the hook. And lastly, there was the gritty and neck-snapping Best Kept Secret, which featured the South Bronx heavyweight Fat Joe the Gangsta. Overall, this album was a fun and funky listen, but I feel it was very important because it helped to lay the framework for the DITC sound going into the mid-90s. So there you have it. My top 5 DITC solo releases. Let me know in the comment section what your top 5 was. It's your boy Mixtape Moth. I'm signing out, but be sure to hit that like button and please subscribe. As always, is peace and blessings. DITC, top 5 solo albums, 1.